In the quiet suburbs of Denver, Colorado, 2021 marked the start of a year full of hopeful resolutions and new beginnings. The neighborhood was one of those picturesque places where neatly trimmed lawns bordered tree-lined streets and kids played outside without a care. For Ben Harris, a 35-year-old mechanical engineer, life was as predictable as the changing seasons. He lived with his wife, Allison, in a modest but cozy two-story home that they'd bought just 3 years ago. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. A loving couple, a stable career, and a bright future ahead. Ben was the kind of guy who thrived on routines. Every morning at 6:30 sharp, he'd roll out of bed, slip on his running shoes, and jog around the block before settling down with a cup of coffee and the morning paper. His friends teased him about being a little too old school. But that was just Ben. Organized, dependable, and grounded. He'd always been like that, even back in college when he and Allison first met. Now, Allison, on the other hand, was his complete opposite. Where Ben was measured and meticulous, Allison was spontaneous and vibrant. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, juggling clients from across the country while managing her own boutique Etsy shop. Her bubbly personality and quick wit had been what drew Ben to her in the first place. She had a way of lighting up every room she walked into, a spark that had once been the cornerstone of their relationship. But lately, things had shifted. Ben couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about Allison had changed over the past few months. She'd become more distant, her laughter more subdued. Her once frequent compliments about his cooking or the way he folded the laundry perfectly had been replaced by an air of indifference. First, Ben chalked it up to stress. Running a business during a pandemic wasn't easy, and he figured Allison just needed some space to decompress. Still, it gnawed at him. Small things kept piling up. Late-night phone calls that she claimed were with clients, a new fitness routine that she suddenly seemed obsessed with, and, most recently, her insistence on spending weekends catching up with old friends. Ben wanted to believe her, to trust the woman he'd spent nearly a decade building a life with. But deep down, a sliver of doubt had begun to creep in. It all came to a head one Friday evening. Ben had just finished a grueling week at work, where a delayed shipment had thrown his entire project timeline into chaos. All he wanted was to kick back, order some takeout, and watch a cheesy action movie with Allison like they used to. But when he walked through the door, he was greeted by an empty house. A note sat on the kitchen counter, written in Allison's neat, looping handwriting. "Out with Claire. Don't wait up. Love you." Ben frowned. Claire was Allison's best friend from college, a feisty redhead with a penchant for margaritas and wild stories. They'd been inseparable back in the day, but Ben hadn't heard Allison mention her in months. It felt off. Later that night, as he flipped through the TV channels in the dimly lit living room, Ben's thoughts wandered. He wasn't the paranoid type, but his gut told him something wasn't right. He glanced at his phone, debating whether to call Allison, but decided against it. He didn't want to come across as controlling. The hours ticked by, and by the time midnight rolled around, Ben was struggling to keep his eyes open. Just as he was about to head upstairs, he heard the soft hum of Allison's car pulling into the driveway. A moment later, the front door creaked open, and she stepped inside, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly tousled. "You're still up?" she asked, feigning surprise as she set her purse down. "Yeah," Ben replied, his tone neutral. "How was your night?" "Great," Allison said, a little too enthusiastically. "Claire and I just caught up, girl talk. It was nice." Ben nodded but didn't press further. He wasn't sure why, but the way she avoided his eyes as she spoke sent a chill down his spine. The next day, Ben found himself going about his usual Saturday routine. Mowing the lawn, fixing the squeaky hinge on the pantry door, and catching up on emails. Allison, meanwhile, spent most of the morning holed up in her home office. By the afternoon, she'd announced she was heading to the gym and left without much fanfare. It wasn't until later that evening, while tidying up the living room, that Ben stumbled across something he hadn't expected. Under the couch cushion, where Allison had been sitting the night before, was a small silver earring. It wasn't hers. Allison's jewelry taste leaned more toward bold statement pieces, not delicate studs. He turned the earring over in his hand, a knot forming in his stomach. This was the moment that everything changed for Ben. The little inconsistencies, the vague explanations, the new gym obsession. It all clicked into place like a puzzle he didn't want to solve. He sat down on the couch, staring at the earring as if it held the answers to all his questions. But the questions wouldn't stop coming. Who did it belong to? Was it just an innocent mistake? Or was there something more going on? Ben's heart raced as he weighed his options. Should he confront Allison? Pretend he didn't see it? Or was it time to dig a little deeper? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Ben made a decision. He wasn't going to jump to conclusions, but he also wasn't going to sit idly by while his suspicions ate away at him. For the first time in his life, he felt a flicker of doubt about his marriage, and he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The morning after discovering the mysterious earring, Ben couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. He decided to approach the situation methodically, as he would with a problem at work. If there was one thing Ben excelled at, it was finding solutions. And this time, the issue at hand was his marriage, or rather, the cracks that were beginning to form in it. The first step, he thought, was observation. He wasn't going to jump to conclusions, but he also couldn't afford to ignore his instincts. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, Ben replayed the events of the past few weeks in his mind. Allison's late nights, her newfound interest in fitness, and the unexplained earring. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle he was struggling to put together. That evening, Allison seemed oblivious to his inner turmoil. She chatted about a new client project she was excited about and casually mentioned that she might need to spend a few late nights finishing it. Ben nodded along, his responses measured. He didn't bring up the earring, not yet. Instead, he listened carefully, trying to pick up on any details that didn't add up. By the time the weekend rolled around, Ben had started keeping a mental log of Allison's behavior. She'd been on her phone more than usual, often turning the screen away when he walked into the room. On Sunday morning, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Ben hesitated for a moment before glancing at the screen. The notification read, "Looking forward to seeing you again, winky face." The sender's name was saved as C. A pit formed in Ben's stomach. Was it Claire? Or was it someone else entirely? His mind raced as he considered the possibilities. Before he could delve any further, Allison's voice called out from upstairs, "Babe, have you seen my hairbrush?" Snapping out of his daze, Ben called back, "Check the bathroom drawer." He quickly set the phone back on the counter and moved to the living room, trying to act as if nothing had happened. But inside, he felt like his world was beginning to spiral out of control. By Monday, Ben couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. He decided it was time to investigate further. That evening, while Allison was at the gym, he sat down at the computer they shared. Her emails were logged in automatically, and Ben felt a pang of guilt as he clicked on her inbox. He told himself it was for the greater good, for the sake of their relationship. Most of the emails were work-related, but one subject line caught his attention. "Can't wait for Friday night." It was from someone named Chris. Ben's heart sank as he opened it. The email was brief but damning. Chris had written about how much fun he'd had during their last meetup and how he couldn't wait to see Allison again. He mentioned a restaurant downtown, one that Ben didn't recognize, and signed off with a casual XO. Ben sat there, staring at the screen, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't paranoia. It was real. When Allison returned home later that night, Ben did his best to act normal. But the weight of what he'd discovered made it almost impossible to keep up the facade. As they ate dinner, he found himself watching her closely. The way she avoided meeting his eyes, the faint smile that played on her lips whenever her phone buzzed. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but he knew he wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, he decided to lay a trap. The following Friday, Ben told Allison he had to work late. She seemed almost relieved, quickly mentioning that she had plans with Claire again. Ben nodded, hiding the anger bubbling beneath the surface. He waited until she left the house, then grabbed his jacket and headed out. The restaurant Chris had mentioned in his email wasn't hard to find. It was a cozy little spot with string lights and outdoor seating. Ben parked across the street, his heart pounding as he scanned the tables. And then he saw them. Allison was sitting at a corner table, laughing with a man who could only be Chris. He was tall, with dark hair and an easy smile, the kind of charm that seemed effortless. They leaned in close, their body language unmistakable. Ben felt a surge of anger and heartbreak as he watched them, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. But instead of storming into the restaurant, Ben pulled out his phone and snapped a few pictures. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was for proof, or maybe it was just to remind himself that this wasn't some nightmare he could wake up from. This was his reality now. The drive home was a blur. By the time Allison returned, Ben was sitting in the living room, staring at the wall. She breezed in with the same carefree attitude she'd always had, setting her purse down and kicking off her shoes. "How was your night?" she asked, her tone casual. Ben looked up, his expression unreadable. "Fine," he said simply. "How was Claire?" Allison hesitated for the briefest of moments before replying. "Good. We just grabbed some dinner and caught up." Ben nodded, his jaw clenched. He didn't press further. He needed time to think, to figure out his next move. But one thing was clear, this wasn't something they could come back from. As the days went by, Ben struggled to hold himself together. He started avoiding Allison as much as possible, spending late nights at the office or going for long drives to clear his head. The thought of confronting her filled him with dread, but the alternative, pretending everything was fine, was unbearable. One evening, after another tense dinner filled with awkward silences, Ben finally reached his breaking point. As Allison cleared the table, he stood up and said, "We need to talk." She froze, a plate in her hands, before turning to face him. "About what?" she asked, her voice wary. "About us," Ben said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "And about Chris." The color drained from Allison's face. She set the plate down slowly, her hands trembling. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Don't lie to me, Allison," Ben said, his tone sharper now. "I know everything. The emails, the dinner, the late nights. You think I wouldn't notice?" Allison opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in their marriage, she looked truly vulnerable, and it was almost enough to make Ben falter. Almost. "I deserve the truth," he continued. "So tell me, how long has this been going on?" As Allison began to speak, her voice trembling with excuses and apologies, Ben realized something. No matter what she said, the damage was already done. The trust they'd built over the years had been shattered, and he wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. But that was a decision for another day. Right now, all Ben wanted was answers. If you've been hooked by the story so far, make sure to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping tales like this. We've got plenty more to unpack, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Ben's world felt like it was spinning out of control as Allison began to explain herself. Her words were a tangled mess of apologies and excuses, each one hitting him like a fresh wave of betrayal. She admitted that she had met Chris at a networking event a few months ago, that they'd started talking, and that things had spiraled from there. Spiraled. That was the word she used, as if it were something that had happened to her rather than a series of conscious choices she'd made. "I never meant for it to get this far," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know how to stop." Ben sat across from her, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You didn't know how to stop?" he repeated, his voice cold and disbelieving. "Allison, you're a grown woman. You knew exactly what you were doing." She flinched at his words but didn't argue. Instead, she dropped her gaze, staring at her lap like a child caught in a lie. Ben's heart ached as he looked at her, at the woman he'd once promised to spend the rest of his life with. How had it come to this? The days that followed were a blur of tension and silence. Ben moved into the guest room, unable to sleep in the bed they had shared for so many years. Every time he looked at Allison, he saw her sitting across from Chris at that restaurant, laughing like she didn't have a care in the world. It was a memory he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. Allison, for her part, seemed to be trying to make amends. She cooked dinner every night, left notes apologizing for everything she had done, and even suggested going to couples therapy. But Ben wasn't sure if any of it mattered. The trust they'd built over the years had been shattered, and he didn't know if it could ever be repaired. One evening, after another silent dinner, Ben finally broke the stalemate. "Why, Allison?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "Why did you do it?" She hesitated, looking down at her plate. "I don't know," she said softly. "I guess I felt neglected." Neglected. Ben's voice rose, incredulous. "I've been working my ass off to provide for us, to build a life together, and you felt neglected? I'm not saying it's your fault," she protested, her voice trembling. I felt lonely, okay? You've been so focused on work, and I needed someone to notice me." "Well, congratulations," Ben said bitterly. "Chris noticed you. Are you happy now?" The tension between them reached a breaking point when Ben discovered that Chris had been texting Allison again. He found the messages while she was in the shower, her phone carelessly left on the nightstand. The texts were vague but intimate, filled with "I miss you" and "Can we talk?" Ben's blood boiled as he read them, his anger eclipsing the sadness that had consumed him over the past few weeks. When Allison emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, Ben was waiting for her, her phone in his hand. "Care to explain this?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Her face went pale as she saw the screen. "Ben, Save it," he interrupted, throwing the phone onto the bed. "You told me it was over. You told me you wanted to fix this. And now I find out you're still talking to him." "I wasn't." "Don't lie to me," he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "I've had enough of your lies, Allison." She stared at him, her eyes wide with fear and guilt. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't know how to tell him to stop." "You didn't know how to tell him to stop?" Ben repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "How about, leave me alone? I'm married? Was that too hard for you?" "I'm trying, Ben," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm trying to fix this." "No, you're not," he said coldly. "If you were trying, you would have blocked his number the moment I found out. But you didn't. You kept the door open for him, and now you want me to believe you're sorry? Give me a break." Ben spent the next few days avoiding Allison entirely. He stayed late at work, took long walks in the evenings, and even started visiting a friend's house just to have somewhere else to go. He couldn't stand being in the same room as her, couldn't stand the sight of her tear-streaked face and her empty apologies. One evening, as he sat in his car outside their house, Ben made a decision. He couldn't keep living like this. He deserved better than a wife who had betrayed him, who had lied to his face and continued to disrespect him even after being caught. It was time to take control of his life. The next morning, Ben woke up early and called a divorce lawyer. As he explained the situation, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was taking a step forward, like he was reclaiming a part of himself that he'd lost in the chaos of Allison's betrayal. That evening, he sat Allison down in the living room and told her his decision. "I've called a lawyer," he said, his voice steady. "I'm filing for divorce." Her eyes widened in shock. "Ben, no. Please, we can work through this." "No, Allison," he said firmly. "We can't. I've given you every chance to fix this, and you've done nothing but make it worse. I'm done." Ben's decision to file for divorce wasn't the end of the conflict. It was just the beginning. When Allison received the official papers a few days later, her reaction was explosive. She confronted Ben as soon as he walked through the door that evening, her face flushed with anger and hurt. "Divorce?" she demanded, waving the papers in the air. "You're really going to throw everything away just like that?" Ben dropped his keys onto the table, his expression unyielding. "I'm not the one who threw everything away, Allison. You did that the moment you started lying to me." "I made a mistake," she shouted, her voice cracking. "One mistake. And you're ready to destroy our marriage? One mistake. Ben snapped, his voice rising. This wasn't one mistake, Allison. This was months of deceit, months of betrayal. And you didn't just make a mistake, you made a choice. Over and over again. Allison's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, Ben thought she might start crying. But instead, she straightened her spine and stared him down. You're no saint, Ben. You've been so wrapped up in work that you barely even noticed me. I felt invisible, and Chris, he noticed me. Don't you dare blame this on me, Ben said, his tone sharp as a blade. I worked hard for us, for our future. If you felt neglected, you should have talked to me. Instead, you went behind my back and betrayed me. The argument didn't end there. It spiraled into a shouting match, each of them airing grievances that had been building for years. Allison accused Ben of being emotionally distant, of prioritizing work over their relationship. Ben accused Allison of being selfish, of taking the easy way out instead of addressing their problems head-on. By the time the fight ended, they were both emotionally drained. Allison retreated to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her, while Ben stayed in the living room, staring blankly at the divorce papers spread out on the coffee table. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he hadn't expected it to be this hard. The tension in the house was unbearable in the days that followed. Allison alternated between anger and desperation, sometimes begging Ben to reconsider and other times lashing out at him for what she called his unforgiving nature. Ben, for his part, tried to keep his distance. He avoided her as much as possible, focusing instead on the logistics of the divorce, dividing their assets, canceling joint accounts, and finding a new place to live. But then something happened that neither of them had anticipated. One evening, as Ben was packing up some of his belongings, he found a handwritten letter tucked into one of Allison's books. It was addressed to her from Chris, and the contents were damning. In the letter, Chris confessed that he had no intention of leaving his wife for Allison. He admitted that their affair had been a distraction for him, a way to escape the pressures of his own marriage. He told Allison that she deserved someone better, someone who could give her the life she wanted, but that he couldn't be that person. Ben read the letter twice, his hands shaking with anger. He felt a twisted sense of satisfaction knowing that Allison had been betrayed by the very man she had risked everything for. But at the same time, he couldn't help but feel a deep sadness for her, for both of them. They had built their marriage on a foundation of love and trust, and now that foundation was in ruins. That night, Ben confronted Allison with the letter. He found her sitting in the kitchen, staring blankly at a cup of tea. When he placed the letter on the table in front of her, her eyes widened in shock. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't matter," Ben said. "What matters is that this man you risked everything for, didn't even care about you. He used you, Allison." Tears welled up in her eyes as she read the letter, her hands trembling. "I didn't know," she said softly. I thought he loved me." Ben shook his head, his voice filled with frustration. "Do you see now? Do you see what you've done? You threw away our marriage for someone who didn't even respect you." "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry." But her apologies, as heartfelt as they were, couldn't undo the damage that had been done. Ben walked away, leaving her alone with her regrets. As the days turned into weeks, Ben and Allison continued to navigate the messy process of ending their marriage. There were moments of civility, moments when they could talk without yelling, but those moments were rare. Most of the time, their conversations were tense and filled with bitterness. One of the most difficult moments came when they had to meet with a mediator to discuss the division of their assets. Sitting across from each other in a sterile office, they argued over everything from the house to the car to the furniture they had picked out together. Each item felt like a piece of their life being torn apart, a reminder of what they had lost. But the hardest part for Ben wasn't the logistics of the divorce, it was the memories. Every corner of the house held a reminder of their life together. The kitchen where they had cooked meals as newlyweds, the living room where they had celebrated holidays, the bedroom where they had once whispered dreams of the future. Letting go of those memories was harder than he had expected. One evening, as Ben sat alone in the empty house, he realized something important. Despite the pain, despite the betrayal, he didn't want to let this experience define him. He didn't want to become bitter or closed off, the kind of person who couldn't move on. He wanted to rebuild his life, to find happiness again. With that realization came a sense of clarity. The divorce wasn't just an ending. It was a new beginning. A chance to start over, to create a life that was his own. Ben's resolve to move forward and finalize the divorce was tested when Allison's desperation reached new heights. As the court date for the divorce proceedings loomed, she showed up unannounced at his office one afternoon, carrying a box of old photographs. She had clearly been crying, her eyes red and swollen, and her usually composed demeanor replaced by a frantic urgency. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. Ben sighed, glancing around the open office space where curious coworkers were already noticing the scene. "This isn't the place, Allison. Please," she pleaded. "Just 5 minutes. I need to say this." Against his better judgment, he led her to an empty conference room, closing the door behind them. She set the box on the table and pulled out a stack of photographs, snapshots of their life together. Their wedding day, vacations, birthdays, quiet moments at home. She spread them out in front of him like evidence in a case she was desperate to win. "Look at these," she said, her voice breaking. "This is us, Ben. This is what we had. It wasn't all bad, was it?" Ben looked at the photos but didn't respond. He saw the memories they had shared, but the pain of her betrayal overshadowed everything. Finally, he shook his head. "Why are you doing this, Allison?" "Because I want you to remember," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I want you to remember the good times, the love we had. I made a mistake, but that doesn't erase everything we built together." Ben's expression hardened. "You're right. It doesn't erase the good times. But it also doesn't erase what you did. Trust is the foundation of a marriage, Allison, and you shattered it." The confrontation was emotionally exhausting for both of them. Allison left the office in tears, and Ben spent the rest of the day struggling to focus on his work. That evening, he met up with his best friend, Lucas, at their favorite bar. Over beers and fried appetizers, Ben recounted the encounter. "She showed up with a box of photos," he said, shaking his head, "as if that's going to fix everything." Lucas leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "It's classic guilt tactics, man. She's trying to appeal to your nostalgia, hoping you'll forget how much she hurt you." "I'm not going to forget," Ben said firmly. "But it's hard. Seeing those pictures, it reminded me of the life we were supposed to have." "You can't let her manipulate you," Lucas said. "She made her choices, and now she has to live with the consequences. You deserve better than this." Despite his determination to move forward, Ben couldn't shake the weight of the situation. The closer they got to the court date, the more he felt the pressure mounting. It wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about letting go of a dream, a future he had once believed in. And as much as he hated to admit it, part of him still cared for Allison, despite everything. That inner conflict came to a head one night when he received a text from her. "Please, can we meet one last time? I just need closure." Against his better judgment, he agreed. They met at the park where they used to walk their dog, a place filled with memories of happier times. Allison was already there when he arrived, sitting on a bench with her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked up as he approached, her face pale in the moonlight. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. Ben nodded, standing a few feet away. "What do you want, Allison?" "I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "Not just for the affair, but for everything. For taking you for granted, for not appreciating what we had. I ruined the best thing in my life, and I hate myself for it." Ben sighed, his emotions a tangled mess. "You should have thought about that before." "I know," she said, "but I just needed you to know that I regret everything. I wish I could go back and change it, but I can't. All I can do is apologize and hope that someday you might forgive me." The sincerity in her voice gave him pause. For a moment, he considered the possibility of reconciliation, of giving her a second chance. But then he remembered the letter from Chris, the lies, the pain. Forgiveness was one thing, but rebuilding trust was another. And he wasn't sure he could ever trust her again. "I hear you," he said finally. "And I hope you find peace with yourself, Allison. But I can't give you what you're looking for. This marriage is over." Allison nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. I'm so sorry, Ben." The court date arrived with a mix of relief and dread. Ben walked into the courthouse feeling a strange sense of finality, like he was closing the door on one chapter of his life and stepping into another. Allison was already there, sitting with her lawyer, her face a mask of calm that didn't quite hide the sadness in her eyes. The proceedings were straightforward. The evidence of the affair, combined with the mutual agreement to divorce, made the process relatively quick. As the judge read the final decree, Ben felt a mixture of emotions: grief, relief, and a glimmer of hope for the future. When it was over, he walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Allison didn't try to stop him this time. She simply watched him go, her expression unreadable. Ben's decision to finalize the divorce set a chain of events into motion that neither he nor Allison could have anticipated. The emotional and legal closure was just the beginning, as the fallout of their broken marriage revealed deeper truths and unexpected twists. The day after the court ruling, Ben returned to the house to pack his remaining belongings. It was an eerie experience, walking through rooms that had once felt warm and full of love, now reduced to a series of hollow spaces. The living room, where they'd celebrated birthdays and hosted friends, seemed like a ghost of itself. He found himself pausing by the mantel, where a photo of their wedding day still stood. Without hesitation, he turned it face down. In the kitchen, he discovered a stack of unopened letters on the counter. Most were bills and junk mail, but one envelope caught his eye. It was addressed to Allison in handwriting that wasn't his. Ben hesitated before opening it, but curiosity got the better of him. The contents were shocking: a series of love letters from Chris, detailing their affair in explicit terms. "You're the only person who makes me feel alive, Allison. Every moment with you is electric. I wish we didn't have to hide anymore." Ben's hands shook as he read the letters. The sheer boldness of Chris's words, his complete disregard for Ben, reignited the anger he had worked so hard to control. This wasn't just an affair. It was a deliberate, prolonged betrayal. Chris had written about their plans to travel together, even mocking Ben's cluelessness. One line stood out: "Once everything's finalized, we can finally be together without looking over our shoulders." Ben realized that Chris had been banking on the divorce as his green light to swoop in and claim Allison fully. But there was no way Ben was going to let them ride off into the sunset without consequences. Armed with the letters, Ben made a decision. It wasn't enough for him to simply walk away. Chris had inserted himself into Ben's life and destroyed his marriage. It was time to confront him directly. Ben reached out to Lucas, who had always been his rock during the ordeal. "You're not doing this alone," Lucas said firmly when Ben explained his plan. "If this guy thinks he can get away with everything, he's in for a rude awakening." The confrontation was set for the following evening. Ben had learned from a mutual acquaintance that Chris frequented a local bar after work. He and Lucas arrived early, staking out a corner booth with a clear view of the entrance. When Chris finally walked in, laughing with a group of coworkers, Ben felt his pulse quicken. "There he is," Lucas muttered, nodding toward the door. "You sure about this?" "Absolutely," Ben said, rising from his seat. Chris spotted him before Ben could close the distance. His laughter died, and a flicker of nervousness crossed his face. But he quickly masked it with a cocky grin. "Ben," he said, holding his drink like a shield, "didn't expect to see you here." Ben wasted no time. He pulled the letters from his jacket pocket and slapped them onto the table in front of Chris. "Care to explain these?" Chris glanced at the letters, his grin faltering. "Look, I don't know what you think you're doing. I'm giving you a chance to own up," Ben interrupted, his voice low and steady. "You destroyed my marriage, lied to my face, And now you're planning to play house with my ex. So go ahead. Tell me why I shouldn't make your life as miserable as you've made mine. Chris's co-workers exchanged uneasy glances, slowly edging away from the confrontation. Chris looked around, clearly embarrassed, before attempting to regain his composure. What do you want me to say, Ben? That I fell for Allison? That she fell for me? It happened. Get over it. Lucas stepped in, his voice sharp. You're unbelievable. This guy was nothing but decent to you, and you repaid him by stabbing him in the back. It's not my fault their marriage was already broken, Chris snapped. I just happened to be there when it fell apart. Ben clenched his fists, but Lucas put a restraining hand on his shoulder. He's not worth it, Lucas said. Let's get out of here. But as they turned to leave, Chris couldn't resist one last jab. Allison deserves someone who actually makes her happy. Ben, you were just a placeholder. Ben stopped, turning back to face Chris. You think you've won, don't you? Enjoy it while it lasts, because when she betrays you the way she betrayed me, you'll finally understand. You're not special, Chris. You're just her next mistake. The encounter left Ben feeling both vindicated and drained. He knew he couldn't let Chris's smugness define his next steps, but it also reinforced his resolve to leave the past behind. That night, as he sat in his empty apartment, he realized something profound. He was finally ready to let go. Allison had made her choices, and Chris had revealed his true colors. They could have each other, but Ben would no longer allow them to occupy space in his mind. It was time to focus on his own healing and the possibilities that lay ahead. Ben's confrontation with Chris marked a turning point. The encounter had allowed him to vent his frustrations, but it also reaffirmed his commitment to moving forward. However, the fallout from his actions was far from over. The next day, he received an unexpected message from Allison. We need to talk. Ben stared at the text, debating whether to respond. The wounds from their marriage were still fresh, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to reopen them. Ultimately, curiosity got the better of him. He replied, agreeing to meet at a neutral location. Later that evening, they sat across from each other at a quiet cafe. The atmosphere was tense, and Ben could see the strain on Allison's face. Her usually composed demeanor was replaced with uncertainty, a stark contrast to the confident woman he had once loved. I heard about what happened at the bar, Allison began, her voice soft. Chris told me. Did he tell you everything? Ben asked, his tone sharp. Allison flinched but nodded. He said you confronted him and that it got heated. Ben leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He didn't mention the letters, did he? Her silence was answer enough. Ben pulled out copies of the letters and slid them across the table. Allison hesitated before picking them up, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. Her face paled as she read the damning words. I didn't know he wrote these, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Of course you didn't, Ben said bitterly. You were too busy lying to notice how deep his betrayal went. Allison looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. I made mistakes, Ben. I know that. But I never meant to hurt you like this. Ben laughed, the sound devoid of humor. You didn't mean to hurt me? Allison, you didn't just cheat. You lied, manipulated, and destroyed everything we built together. And now you're sitting here asking for what? Forgiveness. I'm not asking for forgiveness, she said quickly, her voice cracking. I just want to explain. Ben shook his head, exhaustion evident in his expression. Explain what? That you fell for someone else? That you thought you could get away with it? There's nothing you can say that will make this right. Allison reached across the table, her hand trembling as she touched his. I loved you, Ben. I still do. But something changed between us. You stopped seeing me, really seeing me. Ben pulled his hand away, his jaw tightening. You think this is my fault? That I'm the reason you cheated? No, she said quickly, her tears spilling over. I take responsibility for my actions. But I need you to understand. Our marriage wasn't perfect. We both made mistakes. Ben's anger flared. Don't you dare try to paint this as mutual. I stayed loyal. I fought for us. You threw it all away. The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating them both. Allison wiped her tears, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm sorry, Ben," she whispered. "I know that doesn't mean much now, but I am." Ben stood, tossing a few bills on the table. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Allison. It never will." As Ben left the cafe, a strange sense of closure washed over him. Allison's apology, while too little too late, marked the end of a chapter. For the first time since their separation, he felt a glimmer of hope for the future. But fate had one more twist in store. 2 weeks later, Ben received a call from Lucas. "Turn on the news," his friend said, his voice urgent. Ben grabbed the remote, flipping through channels until he found the breaking news segment. His breath caught as he saw Chris's face on the screen. "Local entrepreneur Christopher Daniels is under investigation for embezzlement," the anchor reported. "Sources say he misused company funds to finance personal expenses, including lavish trips and gifts." Ben stared at the screen, stunned. The man who had upended his life was now facing his own reckoning. It was poetic justice, but it also raised questions. Had Allison known about Chris's schemes? Was she complicit or just another victim of his charm? Lucas called again later that evening. "Guess karma caught up with him," he said, his tone smug. Ben chuckled, the sound tinged with satisfaction. "Yeah, it did. Think Allison's still standing by him?" Lucas asked. Ben shrugged, though Lucas couldn't see it. "I don't know and I don't care. She made her choice. Let her deal with the consequences." Over the following months, Ben focused on rebuilding his life. He threw himself into work, took up new hobbies, and reconnected with old friends. The pain of the past lingered, but it no longer consumed him. Instead, it became a reminder of his resilience, a scar that marked his growth. One evening, as he sat on his balcony overlooking the city, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Allison. "Chris is gone. I'm sorry for everything. I hope you find happiness." Ben read the message twice before deleting it. He didn't need her apologies or updates. He was finally free from the lies, the betrayal, and the pain. For the first time in a long time, Ben allowed himself to smile. The future was his, and he was ready to embrace it. In the weeks following the revelation of Chris's financial crimes, everything seemed to fall into place for Ben. The storm that had upended his life was finally subsiding, leaving him with a sense of clarity and strength he hadn't felt in years. Chris's trial became a local media sensation, with headlines detailing his lavish lifestyle funded by embezzled money. It wasn't just a professional downfall. It was a public spectacle that left no room for redemption. Ben didn't follow the news closely. He didn't need to. Knowing that Chris was facing the consequences of his actions was enough. As for Allison, she disappeared from Ben's life entirely. Whether she chose to leave town to escape the scandal or to start fresh elsewhere, Ben didn't know. Her final message, short and apologetic, felt more like closure than a re-entry point. It was over, and Ben was ready to leave her and their broken past behind. Ben's transformation wasn't just about moving on. It was about rebuilding. He took on new projects at work, ones that pushed him out of his comfort zone and reignited his passion for problem-solving. His career began to thrive, and with it, his confidence grew. For the first time in a long while, Ben felt like his old self, the version of him that had dreams and aspirations beyond his marriage. But it wasn't all about work. Ben started attending a local gym, something he'd neglected during his tumultuous marriage. It became more than just a place to exercise. It was a sanctuary where he could clear his mind and focus on his own well-being. He even joined a hiking group, rediscovering his love for the outdoors. One Saturday morning, during a hike through a nearby trail, Ben found himself chatting with a woman named Emma. She was funny, down-to-earth, and shared his love of nature. They bonded over their mutual disdain for bugs and their shared appreciation for coffee, which led to a spontaneous post-hike trip to a local cafe. Ben wasn't looking for love. Not yet. But Emma's easy laugh and genuine kindness reminded him that connections could still be built on honesty and respect. Over the weeks, they grew closer, and while Ben was cautious, He allowed himself to enjoy her company without the weight of expectation. One of the most pivotal moments for Ben came during a visit to his parents' home. Sitting on their back porch, sipping coffee, his father gave him a piece of advice that stuck with him. "Sometimes, life gives you hard lessons, son," his father said, his voice steady. "But those lessons teach you who you are and what you're made of. You've been through hell, but you're still standing. That says more about you than anything else." Ben nodded, feeling the truth of those words sink in. He'd spent so much time focused on what he'd lost. His marriage, his trust, the life he'd planned. But now, he realized that those losses had made room for something new. A stronger, wiser version of himself. By the end of the year, Ben felt like a different man. The weight of betrayal no longer hung over him like a shadow. He'd learned to trust his instincts, to value himself, and to let go of the things and people that didn't serve him. Chris was convicted and sentenced to several years in prison. It was a fitting end for someone who had lived off lies and deceit. Allison, as far as Ben knew, had moved on quietly. He hoped she found whatever she was looking for, though he doubted she'd ever truly understand the damage she'd caused. As for Ben, he stood on the balcony of his apartment one crisp December evening, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Hot chocolate and a holiday movie marathon tonight? My treat." Smiley face. Ben smiled, typing a quick reply. "I'm in. See you in an hour." He set his phone down and looked out over the city, taking a deep breath. The past year had tested him in ways he never could have imagined, but he'd come out on the other side stronger and more sure of himself than ever before. Life was unpredictable, messy, and full of challenges, but it was also full of possibility, growth, and new beginnings. And for Ben, that was enough. If you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. And of course, subscribe to my channel for more engaging stories and recaps. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.